Just a reminder that this event will be recorded and is streaming live on Facebook. So if you've not already done so, please make sure to mute your microphone. Our presenting sponsor today is Florida Crystals Corporation, and we would like to thank them for helping us make events like this possible. With us today, we have Andrew Sauber. Andrew joined Florida Crystals in 2015 as Director of Corporate Sustainability and focuses on internal improvements in the energy, water, and waste areas, in addition to external communication and community involvement. I'm happy to welcome Andrew to say a few words.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. As Noel said, my name is Andy Sauber, and I manage sustainability for Florida Crystals. Many of you are likely familiar with Florida Crystals and the sugar we produce. What you may not be aware of is how versatile of a crop sugarcane is, and how conducive South Florida is to agriculture. Every part of the sugarcane plant is useful, and we do, in fact, use it all. There's the sugar and molasses that most of us are familiar with. There's also a significant amount of water contained in the plant, and that is used in the milling process. The steam and electricity we generate requires heat, and that is where the fiber, called bagasse, comes in. What remains is eventually returned to the fields where the process started. This geographical area is especially suited to agriculture with abundant rain and sunshine. This is another point of distinction in that we do not rely on the aquifer for irrigation as there is sufficient rain. Sunshine, rather photosynthesis, is where sugarcane truly sets itself apart from other crops. There are two forms of photosynthesis, called C3 and C4, describing the structure of the plant's photosynthetic engine. Sugarcane belongs to this unique club of C4 plants that represent 3% of plant species, yet account for 25% of plant activity on the planet. Put simply, C4 plants grow a lot and fast. It is why we grow enough biomass to be 82% powered by renewable energy as a company. Sugarcane continues to be among the most efficient crops in existence and is poised to meet the world's increasing biomass demands for energy generation, bioplastics, specific products, such as tableware produced at TELUS. Thank you for the time today, and I believe it's back to you, Noel.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew, and appreciate your support. We want to thank Caroline Villanueva as well, who serves on our Board of Governors, and you are both extremely supportive of our organization, so thank you. So before I turn it over to Tim to introduce our panelists, we want everyone to know that we requested questions from attendees prior to the event. But trustees that are on the call right now may submit additional questions via the chat. Just hit the button at the bottom of the screen. And if time permits, we're going to do our best to answer some of those questions later on. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Burke. Tim is the Senior Vice President and Publisher for LRP Media Group. Before joining LRP in 2019, as many of you know, he was publisher of the Palm Beach Post and the Palm Beach Daily News. And before that, he was a multi-market vice president for newspapers in Atlanta, Austin, and Dayton, Ohio. He currently serves on our Chamber's board and executive committee and is a board member of the Community Foundation of the Palm Beaches, Florida Tax Watch, and the Pathfinder Scholarship Awards. Tim, thank you so much for your time, and please feel free to begin.
Great. Thank you, Noel, and welcome to everybody. I look forward to an exciting and certainly timely and relevant conversation today. And I would again reinforce and remind those listening and watching to submit questions as we move forward. So with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel, and I'll begin with the Senator George S. LeMieux, who is a trusted advisor and advocate for significant business, including Fortune 500 companies, their officers and boards, as well as high-profile individuals in Florida and throughout the country. He focuses his practice on resolving business and governmental disputes and advising CEOs and C-suite executives on business, law, and government from a local, state, and national perspective. Senator is served as Florida's 34th United States Senator in the 111th Congress. In the United States Senate, he served on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Armed Service Committee, and the Special Committee on Aging. He served as Florida's Deputy Attorney General and as the Governor's Chief of Staff, overseeing all state agencies and operations. The senator serves as the chairman of the board currently of the Gunster Law Firm and is the founder of the LeMieux Center for Public Policy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Welcome, Senator.
Tim, thank you so much for having me.
Next on our panel is Steve Vancore, who is the president of Vancore Jones Communications and has over 3 decades conducting polling and focus research on voters, as well as running political campaigns. He also owns a polling company and serves as an adjunct instructor in the Masters of Applied American Policy and Politics program at the Florida State University. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Our final panelist is Dr. Kevin Wagner. Dr. Wagner received his JD from the University of Florida and worked as an attorney and member of the Florida Bar in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He left the full-time practice of law and returned to the University of Florida to earn an MA and PhD in political science. He is the department chair in political science at FAU and was awarded the LLS Distinguished Professorship in Current Affairs 2 times. His research area is technology and politics, both in the United States and abroad. He has co-authored 2 books and many research articles in this area. His work has been published in leading journals and law reviews, including Political Behavior, Online Information Review, Journal of Information, and American Review of Politics. His latest book, Tweeting to Power, The Social Media Revolution in American Politics, was published by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Dr. Wagner.
Thank you.
So with that, time is precious, so we were going to move directly to our Q&A portion of the discussion. And again, remember to send your questions as we move forward. And I want to get to these because given the news environment and this election cycle, something else might happen while we're talking and my questions might become all moot. So we're going to get right to it. The first question, the process of voting, to our panel, the process of voting, how people vote, as an example, mail-in voting, has changed dramatically. How does this affect this upcoming presidential race and election day itself in Florida? And we'll start with Dr. Wagner.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Mail-in voting isn't new. It's been around since around the Civil War, so we've had it a while. The biggest difference is the volume of people that are using mail-in voting versus traditional ways to vote. And the biggest implication, of course, is that millions of people are going to vote well before Election Day. In fact, I think my colleague at the University of Florida has it at about 5 million people have voted already, including many in the state of Florida. It means that we really don't have a voting day. We have a voting month, essentially, when people are going to the polls. I think one of the big mistakes we see in the media these days is that they talk about this run up to the voting day, but we're here. People are voting. They're voting fairly quickly in large numbers. The only thing I'd add, and then I'd let my other panelists chime in, is that the biggest difference to me when I look at it is rejection rates for mail-in voting are considerably higher than they are for in-person voting. In other words, the chances of your ballot being disallowed for either sending it in late or not putting the signature on it are considerably higher for mail-in voting. So the one thing that I'm cautious of and I'm thinking about in this election is how many voters are going to have to either correct their ballot or won't have their ballot counted because they did early voting through mail-in and didn't do it either properly or didn't get it in time.
Great. Steve, would you like to follow up from Dr. Wagner?
Yeah, I think everything Kevin said is exactly correct. It's very interesting right now how quickly data is coming back. I represent the Broward Supervisor of Elections, and we've got almost 25% of our ballots, and we mailed them out just last Monday, the final batch, the big batch. They're going out every day still, but 25% are already back. So the numbers you're looking at, the Secretary of State's office, are about 2 days behind. They're coming back very, very quickly, which, by the way, to Dr. Wagner's point, is really good for those who their ballots may be infirm, because that gives the voter an opportunity to cure their ballot, which Florida has a pretty good process. And I'm going to say something that maybe has never been said before, but I have been saying it to a number of national reporters and international reporters. Florida is extremely well positioned to run a relatively smooth election this year, simply because of the point that we've been voting by mail for so long and so well. We're backloading our electorate. With the governor was kind and let us start counting these ballots earlier. So they're being tabulated and processed and put into the machine now. That's why you saw in the August primary, so many counties were able to start posting up significant numbers right around 7 p.m. You've got communities, states like Pennsylvania, for example, that don't have that. We had 14,000 ballots arrive on election day. We had 75 staff there to process them and count them, and still we weren't done until 1 a.m. I can't imagine what it's going to be like in states like Pennsylvania and Kentucky that are looking at a quadrupling or tripling or quadrupling of their vote by mail and don't have the machinery or the law to allow early counting. So we may be hearing on election night people say, well, Florida's numbers are in and everything went pretty smooth in Florida, simply because we're pretty prepared post 2000 for this kind of election.
Senator, I'd like you to pick up the conversation and this question and perhaps also address the perception, whether that's a political, it's political or partisan or not, but the perception that is out there that there quote unquote might be something wrong with the process, which Steve just said is pretty buttoned down.
There's not anything, and Steve is right, and from his lips to God's ears, that people around the country say Florida got it right. And that would be nice, since we've had some other elections that didn't go so smoothly. We're very good at early voting. We've been doing it for a long time. By the way, Republicans were the ones who pushed early voting. They were the ones who passed laws in the state legislature to allow for early voting without an excuse. So it's something that the Republican Party has pushed for a long time in the state. I know nationally there's been some concern about early voting. But the biggest thing is, for everybody who's watching and for everyone you speak to, is make sure once you get your ballot to fill it out and send it in. I mean, I see those, they don't even call them ballots, when they come in and do not get counted because they are in after 7 p.m. They're not even officially called a ballot anymore. And there are bags and bags full of mail every year where people don't get them in on time. So that's the most important thing. Amazingly, more people will vote early this year than vote on election day. We will have maybe 50-60% of the people vote early. And it is not a one-day sale anymore. Now it is a month-long sale. So that's what's really interesting politically too, is that the race can be decided before the end. And right now, I think the race is hardened. And what I mean by that is I think that most people have made their decision, the vast majority. I don't see events that are gonna, upset that, although we've had a lot of surprises so far. So these votes that are coming in, they're the votes that count on election day. And I think Florida's going to do very well. Usually if we have a problem on election day, it's one of two things. One is it's a supervisor who doesn't know what they're doing. And I think we've mostly gotten rid of those. Or two, it's people, there's an overwhelming presence at the polls and we have people standing in line and ballots are collected late and brought to the supervisor's office and not counted until they're late. I don't think that's going to happen this year.
Related question and a follow-up for our panel. Do you have any concerns, or should the electorate be concerned about the technology, the security, the integrity of our voting systems and platforms? And Senator, you want to start this round?
No, I feel good about it. And the reason is that the voting systems, the electronic voting tabulation is not connected to the internet in a way that it could be hacked. So we always have to be careful. The state and the supervisors, I think, have done a good job of setting up firewalls and protecting the information that they need to and not connecting certain information to the internet where it could be capable of hacking. So I think we have to be vigilant, but I don't have any specific concerns about the integrity of the process.
Steve?
Well, Senator LeMieux is absolutely correct, and I'll answer. So that's the hacking question, which is the voter tabulation system is equivalent to hacking someone's refrigerator. It's not on the internet. Now, if they wanted to hack the voter registration system, but then they were successful, we would know immediately by simply scrambling people's precincts to their addresses. The other issue, and I think the president brought up the concerns about vote by mail and the potential fraud. The president's right that if there's going to be fraud, it is in the area of vote by mail, but he's wrong in terms of the volume. It's very small, very little numbers what you see, but it's mostly when people give their ballot to strangers. So we've been encouraging, and I would encourage everybody to share the method, either bring it directly back. We now have this weird one-way process. People get their ballot by mail and they want to bring it back personally because they have a level of distrust in the U.S. Postal Service. And the supervisors of elections are doing a fantastic job of adding drop boxes so people can put their ballots right back in. Where fraud enters into the equation and concerns, Tim, that come into play is when you give your ballot to somebody you don't know. That allows for processes we saw in the Al Gutman race back in 1996. I date myself, I know, where there was ballot harvesting. People were taking ballots and they were not submitting all of them because of certain indicators. So if people don't give their ballot to a stranger, it's actually an extremely secure process because, you know, it goes out through the mail, it's barcoded, it comes back, it's verified, the person's signature, things are sealed, and then they're contacted if there's any kind of problems. And you can only vote once. The systems are set up. The first ballot in is the ballot that counts. So there's almost no opportunity whatsoever for double counting or any of those other kind of shenanigans we hear about.
Dr. Wagner, I know you've written a lot of research around technology and politics. Your thoughts and comments as well, please.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything my other panelists have said. This is, makes for too agreeable a panel so far, right? I mean, there's two issues that we're talking about, right? One is state or non-state actors penetrating our voting system and doing mischief. And there is some evidence that state actors or people acting for state actors have tried to penetrate our system. The good news is that we don't have a national voting system, right? We basically have a whole bunch of little voting systems all across the country. It makes it really, really hard to penetrate, right? Because you got to penetrate all these different counties all across the country, and it's relatively hard to do. The technology is different all across the board, and most of it, especially here in Florida, is not online. So I'm not as worried about that, though. I do think we should have some concern about outside actors trying to make mischief in our election. The other issue is this issue about fraud in the election. In other words, people intentionally casting votes that are ineligible, those kinds of things. The best I can tell you is that we have looked. Political scientists have looked. People in the legal business have looked. Everyone has looked for evidence of some kind of vast fraud, and generally speaking, the answer is it just doesn't exist. It's very, very small. I think people should have confidence in our voting system. We've done it for a really long time, and we've produced relatively accurate results without really any evidence of any kind of widespread fraud. So whether you're voting by mail or you're voting in person, you should have confidence. We do this pretty well.
Thank you.
Can I add a comment to that?
Absolutely.
Right. So when the president came out and said, vote by mail is rife with fraud, et cetera, the intended or unintended consequence of that, and we're seeing the results in real time, Democrats are rushing their ballots back. Democrats are rushing to get their requests in. Democrats are rushing to overwhelm the system early and get their ballots in and counted. Republicans are holding back their ballots and or refusing them and wanting to vote either early or on election day. And what that's leading to is a unprecedented, because George LeMieux is right. The Republicans, I remember when they flipped the state house and Senate in the early 90s, and most of those races were won by what we used to then call absentee ballots. Well, suddenly we're having this dramatic shift where Democrats are owning the day. And I just got off, I spent the morning looking at polls, in Florida polls, and some other data. And the number of what we call 0 of 3 voters, meaning the new voters, people who haven't voted in the last 3 elections, new Democrats are dominating right now. That doesn't mean anything until the end, right? But if I'd rather be in the seat on the team that's putting more points on the board early than the other team. And so I know the Republican Party of Florida has been struggling to remind their voters that we do it right here in Florida. But right now, 2 things are happening. Democrats are turning those numbers back. I just came out of the field with a poll, and one of the questions we ask is, how did you vote? Did you vote by mail? Do you intend to vote early? Do you intend to vote on election day? And right now, among those who say they voted by mail, Joe Biden is winning 60-30 among those who say they voted by mail. And I get the skew, But if I'm on Team Trump, I'm a little nervous about those numbers, because once they're in the can, no October surprise, no Comey letter, no nothing like that can change those votes. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic that this election day, suddenly the data is shifted so dramatically. And God, if we have a big storm on election day or near election day, and that drives down election day turnout, I don't see how Trump's team can recover.
Tim, if I can just jump in here real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the traditionally, by the way, as Steve was explaining, traditionally Republicans have been the mail-in voting party in Florida. Democrats typically did better in-person early voting. That's typically where you saw Democrats surge. It is interesting to see that Democrats have really taken to mail-in voting. And no matter when you score your votes, whether it's early or late, they all count the same. So if I had the choice, I'd rather get them early, right? Because they're in, and then you don't know what happens. Somebody might forget to vote. They might decide not to vote. They might become demoralized. Typical political strategy is, if you convince a voter to vote, convert that, take that win and get it into the ballot box as soon as possible, because you don't know what could happen after that. The one downside I would point out, just as an addendum to what Steve is saying, is we don't know to what degree the Democrats are cannibalizing their early in-person voting or even day of voting with the mail-in voting. And if the rejection rates turn out to be higher, in other words, Democratic votes are rejected at a higher rate because they didn't do the mail-in voting right, either they didn't sign it right or they didn't mail in at the same time, you could actually see a problem that the Democrats might have, which is that, they get this huge volume of stuff mailed in, but it doesn't count the same way as it would on election day. And so I think that the task for Democrats, the task for Republicans is to get their voters to do this early voting. The task for Democrats is to make sure that all this enthusiasm translates into real votes by educating the voter to make sure that they get the mail-in vote done correctly.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's a reverse of what it used to be. I mean, as both Steve and Kevin were saying, Republicans were always pushing for you to vote early, and Democrats, with their souls to the polls efforts and others, were voting on election day or during the early voting in-person days. So it really is the reverse. And if I were just stepping back, you want to be on the side that has more votes in the can. And right now, the Democrats, by pushing this, have more votes in the can. And you're relying upon Republicans to show up overwhelmingly to vote in person on election day. And a lot of things can go wrong on that particular day. So right now, the Republicans have given up their historical advantage of harvesting votes by mail. And the Democrats are capitalizing on it.
Yeah, especially when you see all those new voters returning ballots that never voted before. That's a good sign for the Democrats. And, if you think about, and all the feedback we're hearing about the pandemic is people and some reluctance to show up on election day. I'd rather have my votes in the can today than not.
Steve, you had the next question. It's you had mentioned earlier, and I think all of you actually made a reference to the polls. The question is that there is a perception that polling got it wrong last time. Again, I'm air quoting the word perception here, but what is the reality, and what impact did the 2016 polling have on this year's methodology, if you will, and how predictive, accurate does the panel believe this year's polls are to date? And we'll start with Steve.
So, after 2016, I stopped introducing myself as a pollster because the overwhelming applause was so loud, I had to stop. Let's remember a couple of basic things before we go too far into this. One, the polls that you see on sites like RCP, 270 to Win, electoralvote.com, pollster.com, et cetera, those are the publicly released polls. Those are rarely the polls that the campaigns are relying on. That's part A. Part B is polls, it's such a cliche, are a snapshot in time, not a predictor, although they have predictive value. Things change. If you were to look at the third quarter scores on any typical NFL week, you'll see that there's always a team or two that has a fourth quarter comeback. I'm mindful of the Andrew Gillum, Gwen Graham Democratic primary race where everybody says, all the polls got it wrong, all the polls got it wrong. But the reality of it is, when you looked at those polls and then you went back, because it was the first time in Florida history, we were able to go into each county and look at and break down the vote by mail early voting and election day voting. Well, Andrew Gillum actually was in deep third place among vote by mail, and $9 million worth of attack mail against Gwen Graham. The numbers change, and we see that by the actual votes cast. So you take all those things together, and I would also add that the reality of it is the pollsters have gotten it better. One of the variables, we control for 5 variables for every poll we do, and I know Dr. Wagner does likewise: age, gender, ethnicity, party, and geography. A lot of pollsters don't do that, but now this year, all the big pollsters have also added education level in as a control factor to make sure your sample looks like the nation or whatever you're polling. And so I think they've done a better job with their technologies, and you're seeing more and higher quality polls being released into the bloodstream than we saw 4 years ago. And so, and then the final thought is, it's funny, people were so critical of the presidential polls, which had predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the national vote by 3.1 percentage points, and she won by 2.9 percentage points or something in that area. They really weren't that far off, but what they didn't measure was Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, slight turnout surge. At the time on those RCP graphs, it was like 2 or 3 polls in each one, and most of them were weeks old. So in defense of polling, I think they're getting better, and you don't get to see all the polls that we get to look at, but behind the scenes on behalf of our candidates, which usually show a slightly different story.
Dr. Wagner, FAU and yourself, of course, know a little bit about polling. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree basically with what Stephen said. I mean, the one, let me just, without repeating what he said, let me add a couple of things that I think are interesting to think about. The first is you see a fair amount of this swinging that goes on in the publicly released polls. And I think people think that means that there's a lot of mind changing going on. This poll swung up 3 or 4 or 5 points, and so Biden's doing better or Trump's doing better. In reality, people don't change their minds quite like that. I mean, a poll is a probability sample, right? So what you're going to get is some statistical noise. In other words, things move around without actually anything changing that much. I think the most remarkable thing about the polling this cycle around it, and I bet Stephen probably would agree with me, is that the numbers have been remarkably steady. In other words, you haven't seen sort of these big swings, and when you do, I mean, I'm going to throw a polling term in here. Steven's going to regret me doing this, but I think we see a little bit of what we call partisan non-response bias, which is essentially if your candidate's not doing well, you're not as likely to answer the phone, right, or respond to a pollster, and that can create some movement. That's not really movement, right? It tends to dissipate as people actually get to the polls. I think it's actually been pretty steady. The errors that happened in 2016, people are waiting for education in a way that they didn't before, because we saw that variable made a difference in a lot of the elections. So everybody is kind of doing it. So I don't think the same mistake. In fact, if anything, I think we might be overcompensating for the mistake in 2016. And for the most part, if you go across the states, it wasn't so bad. There were some issues in the industrial Midwest, and there were 2 things. One is they didn't wait as well as they probably should have. And 2, good pollsters stopped polling in that area way too early. And I don't think you're going to see that same mistake get made again. But we're in the field right now at FAU, and a good pollster, we'll tell you all our assumptions, how we put our sample together, what our sample looks like, and allow you to make a decision about whether or not you trust the work that we did. But again, as was said before, it's a snapshot, not a prediction, right? It's a statement of a moment, and things do change. And we're pretty sure, by the way, that Trump surged pretty late, thanks in part to the Comey letter. And so some of that wasn't caught in the early polls. So you have to know what a poll is and not expect it to be sort of a prediction about what's going to happen. It's a statement of what we can measure now within a standard of error.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that, Tim?
Sure.
One thing every pollster has to do, from the best pollster to the not best pollsters, we have to predict what we think the electorate is going to look like. And there's a lot of ways we do that based on voter registration, past performance in similar elections, trend lines, et cetera. And that's something the pollsters who did Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota last time just got wrong. They expected maximum turnout among both groups. Hillary's running around picking out curtains, get the Comey letter. So surge Democrats, as they're known, those Democrats who only vote on election day, sort of ho-hummed it, she's going to win. I don't really like her anyway. And they stayed home, and that allowed Trump to have this very sliver to pop over the top. Good for them. But predicting the model is where we get in danger. And each cycle, Dr. Wagner, you'll really appreciate this. Each cycle, we emerge with one genius and one fool in the polling world. One fool gets it wrong. And using the same modeling, and one of us could have just tweaked the dial a little bit. I remember I called that Charlie Crist was going to lose. And I did it in a public way because my modeling happened to be correct. And I got lucky. Okay, other pollsters got it wrong. And it was just a matter of, we all do pretty much everything else the same. It's the modeling, and you have to predict the model. And you base it on turnout, ballots coming back, et cetera. But you get that wrong, you get everything else wrong.
Yeah,
Senator,
likely voter. I mean, we all screen for some way or another for likely voters. In other words, I mean, we don't really care that much about the opinion of somebody that's not going to vote, right? So you really care about the opinion of people that are voting. So, and people screen for likely voters in different ways, and they model the electorate a little bit. You know, typically people model the electorate based on past performance. You know, that's sort of the you know, you look at, you know, what does an area look like typically when they vote in this kind of election, and then you try and screen it for likely voters. But yeah, if you know, here's the truth, right, Steve? Should I let them in on this one? If the electorate behaves in a way that is totally unanticipated, in other words, a group of voters that usually never vote come out in large numbers, you're going to get a higher rate of error. I mean, that's, you know, that's the reality we live in.
Senator, it struck me when Steve mentioned, you know, there's public polling and then there's internal polling, which of course I think people realize, but you obviously have had experience with both. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and perhaps maybe what that internal polling looks like and how you pay attention to that?
Well, I ran a campaign for Charlie Crist when he ran for governor, and we would get, you know, we would poll, and then at the end we were getting daily tracking, and you really look at the trend more than you look at the absolute numbers. You want to see what the trend is. You know, my view of polling, and I am not an academic like these two gentlemen, so I'm going to give you an opinion that's less informed, is my view of polling is that it's harder and harder to predict how voters are going to vote, that there is a distrust among voters of polls and polling outfits. So, you know, if you look back at the last two presidential elections, I remember, you know, seeing polls of Hillary Clinton going to win, and I remember seeing polls of Mitt Romney going to win, and those didn't turn out to be true. So I think I think polls are helpful, but we don't know the sort of motivating factors that may get people to turn out over this last month of voting. I believe that, you know, intensity really matters in elections. I would tell you that prior to the debate and prior to the president getting COVID, I would say here in Florida that the intensity was with the president. I'm not so sure about that now. If you would have made me pick a week ago, I would have said the president was going to win Florida. And now I'm not so sure about that. And I have as much ability to tell you what's going to happen in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin as anybody else here, because we don't know, and they're not our states, and we don't have the same feel for it. So intensity really matters. It's what drives people to the polls. It's the message that gets people out. It's what hurt Hillary Clinton because there wasn't intensity behind her. It's what hurt Mitt Romney because there wasn't intensity among Republicans. The question for Democrats has been, can their dislike of the president be enough of an intensity motivating factor to get people to vote? Because frankly, my view and what I hear from Democrats is they're not thrilled with their pick with Joe Biden, but is there going to be enough intensity against the president to drive people to the polls? Right now, if you look at the early voting, it looks like that's the case. We'll get to find out on the 3rd of November.
So the senator has already answered my next question. So this is how good this panel is. He's already answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it for the benefit of our other two esteemed panelists as well. How do you envision recent events, the COVID diagnosis of the president, racial and social unrest, the Supreme Court nomination? How do you see these events, these recent events, affecting voter, there's the word, Senator, intensity and turnout? And I'll turn to you, Steve.
No, it's funny, Tim. We got to find some reasons to disagree on something here, right? This is getting.
I'm trying. I'm doing my best.
And we didn't pre-rehearse any of this.
No, we didn't.
I would have said nothing matters until, you know, it's like you went from this is going to be the COVID election. No, it's going to be the Black Lives Matter election. No, it's going to be the post-RGB election. No, it's going to be the taxes election. The RGB, the death of Justice Ginsburg, I think was a redefining moment for about 12 seconds. Because, and I had predicted, just like Senator LeMieux, that Trump was going to win the state. And it was looking that way. And the reason was we danced that dance once before, the Democrats lost it. The issue of who sits on the court is a much more intensity driving issue for Republicans than it is for Democrats. They tend to be all over the map on that. And then that lasted for about a minute, right? And I think the big defining issue right now is the president getting COVID takes your commander in chief of not just the country, but of the campaign out of commission for a week when he can't afford to be out of commission for a week. It changes the narrative about who's strong, who's weak. Remember, he went into the debate. That debate, the aftermath of that looked like it hurt him, but him being weakened by COVID gets us back onto the frame of COVID, right? We were on the frame of Supreme Court nominees, and now we're back under the frame of COVID. If you're the president's team, you want to be talking about Supreme Court. You don't want to be talking about COVID. Their data shows it. Our data shows it. Everybody's data shows if the frame of this election is about COVID, that works to the disadvantage of the president. So for this minute, the question is about COVID. By the end of this call, I think, Tim, you started out by saying something new may happen. We may be no longer talking about COVID. It's quite remarkable that in this Twitter era we are in, that not only are we siloed and few people change opinions, but intensities change based on what the message is. And that message is about as long as an email and then it's gone. So who knows what the next 2 weeks will bring, but for right now, advantage Democrats.
And Dr. Wagner, your FAU poll, your latest poll is coming out soon. So good timing, right?
Yeah, well, there's no bad timing anymore.
Right.
Something's always happening. The number of undecideds in our polling and in most of the national polling is relatively low. So it's not an election of persuasion. People aren't watching these debates to be persuaded about which candidate they are. And cheers to the networks who find these undecided voters under some rock somewhere. The vast majority of people have already decided. So the question really is a question of intensity. In other words, who is better able to translate their supporters into voters? And I think Stephen's quite right that the Supreme Court is a much stronger motivator for conservative voters, and it was one of the reasons that gave Trump a fair amount of intensity in 2016. And you know that the Democrats know that because if you saw how Senator Harris answered the Supreme Court question, she turned it into a healthcare question, right? She turned it back to the Affordable Care Act. The issue of COVID, the Affordable Care Act, and how the nation has dealt with the pandemic is a much more motivating issue for Democrats. And so I think that they do want to focus on that issue. But it is really hard to know. I mean, this has been one of the most unusual election years. I hate to overstate things, but certainly in my memory. And so I don't know what the issue will be next week. I don't know what the issue will be when we go for lunch. But here is the thing that would worry me if I were the president. It's not like it's not like we're fighting to see who gets out on top, and then on election day, whichever issue's there is the one that's going to win. People are voting now, right? They're voting right now. Election is happening. So you want as much of that messaging as possible during this entire period. And right now, that messaging is really favorable towards the Democrats in the sense that, they're going to talk about healthcare and they're going to talk about COVID-19. And I think that's been sort of the dominant narrative for the early part of this election. So, that's where we're at.
And I'll just echo that messaging is everything, and fighting on your issues versus fighting on your opponent's issues. And COVID is not the president's issue. COVID is the Democrats' issue. So law and order would have been the president's issue. The Supreme Court would be the president's issue. Doing a better job of restoring the economy and bringing jobs back than what the Democrats will do. You saw Vice President Biden continually try to turn environmental issues in the presidential debate into jobs issues, right? That's the turf Republicans want to fight on. Right now, because the president is sidelined, it's all about COVID. And there's a reason you see the president and the vice president and Senator Harris wearing masks all the time. It's not just because they want to stay safe. They are echoing a message. They are portraying that the world is dangerous and sending the message that the reason why the world is dangerous is because of the president.
So the next question, it relates to what happens after the election, and with the recognition that, of course, voting has commenced and is ongoing, but what can we expect, right after, in the aftermath? What can we expect as far as legal challenges, lawsuits, et cetera, if Trump wins and if Biden wins, both scenarios, Senator?
It all depends upon how close it is, Tim. If we are within 0.5%, we have a manual recount in Florida. If we're within 0.25%, we're within a hand recount. If the elections are that close, then there will be challenges. And we had that in 2018 with the governor's race, the US Senate race, the Commissioner of Agricultural race. We have historically close elections in Florida. If the election is not close, these challenges are not going to really develop in my mind, because you can't change the outcome. It's only when you're within, a few thousand votes that these really become difficult legal battles. So the caveat to that would be if there was some, evidence of widespread problems on election day or widespread voter fraud on election day, and I don't expect that to happen.
Senator, just related, do the rejection rates that the panel referenced earlier, the potential of a high rejection rate, factor into this, in addition to like the margin of victory or defeat? If it's close, and we're trying, if you're on the side that's trying to capture 2,000 or 3,000 ballots to make a difference, then yes, everything will be questioned. You'll be trying to argue that the ones that were rejected shouldn't have been rejected, and those all need to be inspected by the canvassing board. But if we're not close, it won't matter. And there's lots of votes every year that don't get counted or thrown out because there are problems, and no one complains about it because the election's not close. One thing I want to say is, watch these other states, though, for that it was mentioned earlier, that are not experienced with this much early voting and by mail voting. And in states where there's a competitive US Senate race, there could be lots of litigation about that, because the Senate is very close in terms of Republican control. And right now, the Republicans are defending a ton of Senate seats around the country, some of which are very competitive. So if you want to have something to keep an eagle eye on election day is some of these Senate races around the country. Steve, would you like to address the similar question in terms of perhaps your expectations if we have a close versus a not so close result?
So I'm tempted to just say ditto to what Senator LeMieux just said, but since you have me on as a panel and I have to sound smart on my own accord, I'll continue to talk. I just finished reading a book called How Democracies Die, and if you want to be depressed, put it in context for you. I read 1984 for the fourth time as a little pick-me-up. It was that sad, but Senator LeMieux is exactly right. It depends. Let's just go through the scenario, because if the president wins, he stays in. I don't think anything's going to come of that. But if Joe Biden wins, and the president has already set the predicate by laying out clearly and effectively and repeatedly that vote by mail is fraud, is going to be fraud on election day, blah, 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 blah. And so if it's close, if Biden comes in the 270s mark, even in 280s mark, and Pennsylvania, which is likely not to have results it's almost impossible that Pennsylvania, which is a swing state, will have results on election night. The fear that I would have is that our democracy becomes in jeopardy. And let me give you a bellwether to watch. The Constitution would then turn a disputed election like that over to the House of Representatives, but then it gets blessed by the Senate. If the first speech that Mitch McConnell gives, if we're close, criteria number one is if it's relatively close, and because remember, what's going to happen on election night is the red areas come in first, because the rural communities report easiest and first. The delays are in the urban communities, the Broward counties, the Miami counties, the Philadelphia areas, the Pittsburgh areas. So the election always starts, usually starts relatively red and gets bluer. Well, take Pennsylvania off the Electoral College map, take potentially Michigan off the Electoral College map. It's going to look earlier in the evening better for Trump. If it comes out even, the bellwether for me is, what's Mitch McConnell's first speech look like? If Mitch McConnell's first speech is, hey guys, there's been a lot of reports of fraud. We're going to have to look into this. We're going to have to delay declaring the election. We're in big trouble. If Mitch McConnell's first speech is, we held an election at the state level, we defer to the states, we defer to the counties in those states, the Constitution pushes that down, we had an election, the outcome is what the outcome is, then our democracy is probably safer. And to what Senator LeMieux was referring to as well is throws another interesting, I haven't heard anybody talk about this. If the Senate flips to Democrat, there's a personal reason for Mitch McConnell to want to invalidate the election. Now, so because he loses his personal power. So maybe I'm overstating it, but if you read what the president's saying, he's clearly setting a predicate to say the election is invalid. If I lose, I may not accept the outcome of this election, then it's going to be up to our representative bodies in our Constitution to stand up and say, no, Mr. President, we held an election and the results are the results. Have a nice day. You've got 2 months to vacate the White House. So I'm a little worried about it for other reasons. I hope it's clear sailing for the winner so that we don't have a disputed election. I believe strongly in the vibrancy of our democracy, and we tend to be slipping a little bit on that, and that worries me a little bit.
Dr. Wagner, how worried are you?
Well, thanks for dropping that on me, Steve. Yeah, so I write a column for Gannett Palm Beach Post called the Civics Program, and I've gotten more questions about how the Electoral College works and what happens in all these different events. And so I've spent a lot of time in the weeds, looking at constitutional amendments and history to try and figure out, well, if this, if it happens like this, what happens? If it happens like that, what happens? And believe me when I tell you, that is a hard thing to put into a column. I think you can appreciate that, Tim.
Indeed.
There are so many possibilities, and that the Constitution didn't anticipate that could happen. What I worry about, I think a little bit about profiles and courage, and do we have political leaders that are willing to stand up for the Constitution and the country and democracy rather than their own personal ambition? And the answer to that question sometimes troubles me at night, and I hope the answer is more positive than sometimes it appears to be in Washington. With that said, I mean, one of the tricky things is, remember, the Electoral College, it gets reported on December 14th, which I think is 41 days after Election Day, according to law. But it doesn't technically get counted until January 6th, which is the new Congress, right? So the new Congress counts the vote. And so if it actually has to go to a contingent election, for those of you not familiar, essentially, if they don't get enough electoral votes to elect a president, the House gets to vote, and then the Senate votes for vice president. In the House, you vote by state, though. You don't vote by individual. And because you vote by state, even though the Democrats control the House and likely will in January of next year, they might not control the state contingency, though they might, depending on how some of these elections swing. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on. And then, of course, in the Senate, they vote for the vice president. If the House can't agree, then the Senate picks the vice president, and then the vice president becomes the president. Fun, right? But the tricky part is so if the Senate votes for assembles a vice president elect, right, they get to vote individually, not by state. But you need a majority in both. So you need 51 senators, and you're going to need a majority of the states, 26 states in the House. So it gets pretty complicated there, right? So here's my biggest answer. I hope somebody wins clearly and plainly, in a way so that we don't end up having to litigate these issues and debate these issues. I mean, let me just reinforce something that the senator said. There's always going to be a certain amount of ballots that gets discarded for any number of reasons. A certain number of ballots always get turned in with nothing on them. Not sure why that happens, but it does, right? In political science, we call it ballot spoilage. And for the most part, which is kind of a funny term, like this ballots don't spoil really, but the idea is you're going to have a certain number of ballots that aren't going to count. And for the most part, we don't pay that much attention to it because the margins are usually much greater than the problem ballots. If you get to the situation where it is particularly close, then we get to like sort of the Bush versus Gore thing, where we're back looking at some of these ballots, trying to figure out if we can figure out what the intent of the voter is, which is inherently kind of problematic. So back to my original point, I hope we have a clear, plain winner that everybody can recognize, and we don't have to address some of these issues that would be somewhat novel.
Tim, let me just add 2 points to that. One is,
Yes.
if Donald Trump wins Florida, then we could be on the path to having all of these challenging scenarios that were just outlined. If Vice President Biden wins Florida, it's basically over, because for a Republican to win the Electoral College without winning Florida is extremely difficult. So watch Florida. Florida will have its votes in quicker. If the vice president wins Florida, probably I would say 80% chance that means the vice president will win the election. So Florida will be key. The second thing is just to echo the comments, the last thing we need in this country is for this to get decided by the Congress. Americans, very educated Americans, don't know this process because it hasn't been utilized in hundreds of years. You know, I think the Thomas Jefferson election was decided in the House.
1800, that's right.
Right. So the idea that you could have one party in the majority that would vote for one candidate, but the delegation of states could vote for another one will drive the American people apoplectic, right? They will think that that is rigged. People will not accept the outcome. And I think that would be a horrible experience for the country. So I add my voice to the choir, which is, let's hope we have a clear and decisive winner.
Because otherwise we could have Aaron Burr as our vice president, and that would be awful.
You know how that ends up.
Well, let me say first, thank you. We ran over our allotted time, which is always a great indication of the panel. And this panel is outstanding. I would suggest we distribute this to every American voter out there every day until the election. Just an outstanding discussion, super informative, providing a whole just a tremendous amount of clarity. So thank you to our panelists. We might have time for one question, an additional question from those who are watching and listening elsewhere. But if we do, I'm going to turn it over right now to Whitney West.
Thank you, everyone. We do have a few questions. Our first question is from Dave Markarian. This is for Senator LeMieux. I love the LeMieux Center and the speakers and conversations that it offers us. The national conversation on race concerns many of us that love Palm Beach County. So can you see a role for us to play the way you have with the LeMieux Center, e.g. race and voting rights, dog whistle references to suburbs and Cory Booker, et cetera?
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you for the nice words about our Public Policy Center. We bring in speakers every year, and we're looking at speakers this year to talk about social justice issues and issues about race. I live down in Broward, and I've been working a lot on these issues with my friend Eugene Pettis, who was the former president of the Florida Bar, and we're just trying to start conversations. I think it's really important that we talk about race, we talk about experiences, and for those of us who are white, that we get a better sense of what it's like to live and grow up here in Florida as a person of color. One of the things that I'm working on with a group of people here in Broward is that we had a lynching in the 1930s in Broward that no one knows about. Sun Sentinel, to their credit, recently published an article about it. And we want to educate people. You know, the thing about Florida that's wonderful is that everyone's come from someplace else. There's very few people who've been here multi-generations. So you don't know the history and sort of the structural problems that we've had on race that still impact our society today. So I really appreciate that question. We're going to tackle that issue at the LeMieux Center. And I think we all need to be talking about these issues and having what people call uncomfortable conversations so that we can better understand each other.
Thank you, Senator LeMieux. Our next question comes from Antonio Fins with the Palm Beach Post. How do we know if mailed-in ballots are being already rejected because of signature or other issues? And if so, how many? Stephen, if you want to take that.
I can answer that. You know, because one of the things we have, and I could speak on behalf of Broward, we follow the same law as everybody else. So it's a complex process. It's a 5-step process when a ballot comes in. But what the good news is, if a ballot is infirm, either spoiled or improper signature, very, 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 very few are ever rejected because George LeMieux signs and Sally LeMieux signs their own name. It's when George is going to the ballot and he sees, I don't even know if you're married, George, but your spouse didn't sign, you signed for them, you signed your name, mismatched that bold, is why they get rejected. But if they are rejected and they're in early, that's good news, because you have 3 ways to contact the voter. You can email them, and we email them and call them and mail them a postcard. And then they have up until Thursday at 5 o'clock after the election to submit what's called a cure affidavit. So for those of you who are voting by mail, you can go onto the websites. I know Wendy Lincoln Palm Beach has it. I know Byron, they all have it. You can see if your vote counted. Secondly, if it's not on there, give them about 4 or 5 days, you can call, or they will contact you to say, hey, your signature was wrong, or you didn't seal it, or whatever. And then you can file a cure affidavit to make sure your ballot gets caught. It's so critical. A, don't give your ballot to a stranger. B, get it in early so you can go online or call and make sure it was counted. And this way, if it wasn't, you can fix it, which is a really nice part of the process. You can't do that on election day if you double mark and your ballot goes in and the optical scanner for some reason doesn't kick it out. You don't have that cure opportunity. So, or if you mail it in on Saturday or Sunday, you don't have that cure opportunity either. So for the get it in early, that cure opportunity is there.
Thank you, Stephen. One last question. I thought it would be interesting if we can have each of the panelists end with their prediction of who's going to win Florida. So let's start with Dr. Wagner, and then we'll go to Stephen and then Senator LeMieux. Dr. Wagner?
You had to go to me first, huh? Well, we're in the field right now with a poll, so I'd feel better if you gave me a couple of days to see what my poll looks like. I think Florida's going to be very close. It typically is. I think whenever you've seen any candidate get relatively farther ahead, it gets close. I think it's going to be very close. I don't think I would predict here, because I just, as a probability guy, I would just tell you that it's going to be pretty close.
Stephen, your thoughts?
I'm the guy who usually leans into this in terms of not wanting to go with, who I would prefer. But I have seen every vector right now is pointing towards a Biden win. The Bloomberg money, the turnout scores, the new number of Democrats voting, the reliance the Republicans have on a late-breaking strategy, the president at a commission, 5 publicly produced polls, which all look pretty good to me, my own polling. I'm going to give it to Biden right now. And is by as many as what would constitute a landslide in Florida, he could win by as many as 2 to 3 points.
Okay, thank you. Senator LeMieux?
I think the president will win. I think it'll be less than 1%. It's going to be very tight. Joe Biden has a challenge with Hispanics voters in Florida that Hillary Clinton did not have. So even though I think there is some momentum for Biden because of all the things that Steve and Kevin have talked about, I think that there's still a lot of intensity for the president. And I think the president's going to do better with Hispanics than he did 4 years ago.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you, Tim, for moderating. I'll turn it back over to Noel to close out our program.
So, wow, thank you so much, everyone. That was great. I am getting all kinds of texts and emails and chats on how great the panel was. So thank you so much. Great content, very informative, like Tim said. So we cannot thank you enough. Thanks again to Tim Burke, Senator LeMieux, Steve Vancore, and Dr. Wagner for being with us today. We want to make sure to thank Florida Crystals Corporation for their presenting sponsorship. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your support, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.